Welcome to Australian Hiker, your online hiking resource. We're your hosts, Tim and Jill Savage.
This is episode 131 of the Australian Hiker podcast. And in this week's episode, it's Australian Hiker's third birthday.
Yay!
So on the 11th of November 2016, we launched Australian Hiker, both the podcast and the website. And over the last 3 years, we've certainly had a lot of a fairly large learning curve, and we've certainly learned a lot, and we've enjoyed what we've been doing. So in this episode, we're going to be doing an overview of how the last 12 months has gone. We're going to talk about where we're heading to over the next year as far as the website and the podcast is concerned. And at the request of a few of our listeners, we're going to talk about some of the aspects of getting the podcast to air. We hope you enjoy. Okay, so the first thing we're going to look at is the podcast itself, the Australian Hiker podcast. Now, the Australian Hiker podcast is the longest running and most downloaded hiking podcast in Australia. And over the past year, we've reached a few milestones from our perspective. This episode is episode 131, and it's actually our 132nd episode, as we did have an episode 0, which was just a very short episode that told people what we were about.
It was the episode that you have when you're not having an episode.
That's right, yeah. And I must admit, it's we sort of cringe when we listen back in that very first episode. It was only a few minutes long, but it was very obviously we were reading the text, and it was a very, very sharp learning curve for us at that stage.
Even when we weren't reading the text, it seemed like we were reading the text.
Okay, so since we launched in 2016, our podcast has now been downloaded over 340,000 times. It's been downloaded in over 140 countries. And our top 10 countries for those that are interested, with the obvious one being Australia at number 1, United States, United Kingdom and New Zealand, and then surprisingly enough, Japan, and then Canada. So I would have almost expected all the English-speaking countries to be in the top ones, but Japan pips out Canada in that respect.
They must love that Aussie accent.
I think so. After Japan, we then have Germany, France, and Vietnam. Now, Vietnam might be a strange one to a lot of people, thinking what is so special about Vietnam? But when you think about it, Osprey has their factory in Vietnam, and there are a number of other hiking manufacturers that operate out of Vietnam as well. So it's not unexpected that Vietnam is in that list. One other comment I would make about the podcast is, we've talked about the overall number of episodes, and again, we are really happy with the number of downloads we've had this year, and in fact, we've actually had 204,000 downloads this year, which is more than we expected, particularly given the way that podcast downloads are measured has changed quite dramatically in the industry this year. Not something that you as hikers tend to need to know, but we expected a reasonable drop-off as a result of the change in measurements, and if anything, it went the other way. We got quite a large increase. So certainly we're really happy with that. Our audience is 89% Australian, which is understandable with a name like the Australian Hiker podcast. And one thing that probably for us says something is that from a download perspective in the first month of release, we, as the Australian Hiker podcast, sit within the top 15 to 20% of all podcasts worldwide, not just hiking podcasts.
That is just amazing. When I saw that, I just thought, wow, that is unbelievable. And, who would have thought? If you'd listened to episode 0, who would have thought?
One final thing I would say on the podcast this year is for the first couple of years we were hosted on SoundCloud and we changed over to Podbean more from a logistical point of view in the background. It doesn't really mean too much to people if you're listening online, but if you have been listening through SoundCloud and noticed that there seems to be less episodes being produced, it's because we're not adding new episodes to SoundCloud. All our new episodes are going onto Podbean, which flow through to things like Apple Podcasts and all the other hosting services as well. In relation to the website, we've released 130 trail reviews, and something we've said over the last couple of years, we are never going to have thousands and thousands of trail reviews on our website, and I suppose because what we actually do is actually a review. We walk and take photos and tell you about our experiences on the trails themselves.
Yeah, and it's also about getting there and getting back and what you need to do it well.
And I think the thing with that is it's one of those things that we are Canberra-based, as many of you are aware, so a lot of our hikes have certainly been in the Australian Capital Territory and in the surrounding regions. I think we still have about 4 more hikes left to do in Canberra.
Who would have thought that?
And the thing that, by sheer accident more than anything else, the last 4 walks that we've got left to do are all around about the 15 to 20 kilometre mark. And I must admit, I don't particularly want to be doing walks that length in the middle of summer in that end of Namadgi National Park. So it may be that we don't finish those off until sort of partway through next year. But we are starting to spread out into New South Wales. And we now have trail reviews in every Australian state and territory. And I'll be upfront here, in some of the states, it's only a sort of 2 or 3. But certainly for us, this is a long-term thing. And over the next 3, 4, 5 years, we will certainly start getting more and more into the other states as logistics allow us to do a number of hikes in each of those states.
And then, of course, I guess at some point we have to go back and revisit.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I'd say there is we do try and go through and check the trail reviews every so often, and this goes for every article that we do on both the blog or through the blog. And I'll give you an example here. There's a couple of hikes that we've got listed up in Queensland where there were some fires that went through earlier this year, and that has impacted on those walks. So we need to be able to sort of put a bit of an advisory text in there saying, please note fires have gone through here in the last year, so the experience that you see may actually be different. And as we're recording this, there are some fairly major fires impacting on New South Wales in particular. And it's one of those things, and Queensland as well. And it's one of those things that sometimes you just don't have much control. And while we have reviewed and done the walks, things certainly change. But if people tell us that things have changed or varied, we'll sort of make the adjustments where we can. We've done 302 gear reviews, and so really that's averaged at around about 100 a year, and we'll talk about where we're taking that over the next 12 months. We've also done 146 general articles on hiking practice, safety, recipes, definitions, and fitness, and these sort of reviews do take a reasonable amount of time. As far as the trail reviews are concerned, by the time it takes us to actually drive to the site, do the walk, drive back home again, do the write-up, edit the photos, and then go through and put the whole lot together, it actually takes me probably around about 3 to 4 hours in total. The actual text is the fairly minimal sort of part. It's just bringing it all together. One of the things that you may note that has changed with the website only over the last week or two has been the inclusion of a new map in our trail review site. And this is a map that has pins that take you to the starting destination of a hike. And what this means is that rather than having to know that ACT is probably pretty easy. You know where the walks are. They're in a fairly confined area. But, if you're looking at reviews for walks in New South Wales is a pretty big state, and it's nice to know that you're in a particular area of the state and you can go to that area and see if we've got any walks reviewed. And by no means, there are thousands of walks throughout Australia, so it's highly unlikely that we're ever going to get all of them. But you can be sort of guaranteed that what you're reading is reality. It's not just something that's been copied and pasted from somebody else's website. So the gear reviews, the trail reviews, and the general articles all take a long time to put together. And I suppose to give you an idea, the average amount of time that I would spend on the podcast and the website is probably around about 20 hours a week, and that doesn't include the walks. And Jill's time is sort of on top of that as well. And she certainly does quite a lot, but it varies. Sometimes she may not have much input into it. Other times she's doing quite a lot of the reviews or the write-ups. It just depends on her work schedule more than anything else.
Yeah, well, it's a little bit hard for me to review or do a write-up of male hiking clothing, Tim, or size 15 hiking shoes. So there are some limitations there,
Yeah, and we will talk about what's happening over the next year on that basis as well. It's the sort of thing that we really have fallen, or I in particular have really fallen in love with the website and the podcast. And I'm just looking at ways that we can improve what we're doing and ways that we can do more of what we're doing as well.
So before we start to look forward, can we have a look at the highs and lows of the last year?
I'll leave some of them. Actually, before we go too much in detail on that, I'll leave the highs and the lows in the podcast in particular, because we're going to talk about getting the podcast to air more specifically. The highs and lows for the year for me, I must admit, I have done a variety of walks this year, and certainly our big walk for this year was the Human Hovel Track. And I suppose a low for me in that respect was not being able to finish the track this year as a complete through hike. We will be doing that walk, or finishing the remainder of that walk early next year. But it was a bit disappointing from my point of view that I didn't manage to actually complete it all in one go.
Yeah, but the highs were definitely seeing all of those Pterostylis orchids on the Human Hovel Track. I mean, that was pretty impressive. So not diminishing the fact that you didn't finish the full 400 and something kilometres, but those orchids were amazing.
That for me probably was the only real low of what we were doing this year, and apart from the orchids that Jill mentioned, Jill really does love orchids, and that was her first job out of uni was working with orchids at the Australian National Botanic Garden. So it's there has been quite a lot of highs, and I've enjoyed a number of the shorter walks that we've done that might only be 5 or 6 kilometres, or even one we did last weekend, which was out to Marble Arch in Dewar National Park. That was an enjoyable walk. It really was. And it's the sort of thing that sometimes you enjoy something that you're not necessarily expecting that you're going to go through and like.
Yeah, so I'd agree with all of that, and it does depend on where you are in the moment and what you're seeing. We did have some interesting responses to some of our gear reviews. Probably the most controversial one that we had was the Peebol. That definitely got people talking to us about why on earth would you do this. And so to refresh your memory, Peebol was a bag of gel and essentially you pee in the bag and it absorbs the urine, and you can reseal the bag and you can use the bag several times. For hikers, that probably isn't such a big issue or a big need, and certainly a lot of our hikers told us that and said, why on earth wouldn't you just go in the bush? And yes, you could, but sometimes people don't want to do that. But it is one of those things that I still think is good for travellers, for remote workers who don't have easy access to toilet facilities. So it has a lot of application, but it definitely did get people talking. I guess that's a good thing.
The other positive from our perspective as well is we find that on average, with the things like the pea bowl that Jill just mentioned, which was, as I said, is
an aberration.
Is probably the most controversial review we've done. But I think the positive response we get from people on the reviews that we do, the gear reviews that we go through and do, I've done for a couple of reasons. One, it's because I probably more so than Jill need a new piece of gear, and I want constantly, yep. And I'm always trying things out, and there's new product on the market as well. So for a lot of our reviews, particularly in the first 2.5 years, we purchased the gear ourselves, and I ended up using it. So I have about 8 pairs of shoes sitting downstairs in the cupboard that are still well and truly usable, but. If I ever stop doing the blog, I think I've got enough shoes to last me for the rest of my life. But yeah, we find that the other thing with the gear reviews as well is, and this is another positive from our perspective, we've gained a lot more credibility within the industry, and we're finding now that a lot of manufacturers and distributors are actually contacting us to do reviews. And we certainly will do reviews of not everything, but just about everything that people ask. And people have commented that a lot of our reviews tend to be positive. There has been a couple of products that I've reviewed that I've given them such poor scores, not from a safety perspective. I didn't think they were much use from a hiking perspective. And as a result, I didn't actually post them up online as opposed to putting a really bad review online. I must admit, if something comes up and it's a really unsafe piece of equipment, and that's pretty rare these days, things like that tend not to happen these days, I will certainly review it just to let people know. But certainly there's always tends to be positives with gear, but whether I would actually use it is another matter.
And I think the thing is about the gear reviews is that we're doing this from a personal perspective, and we do say this a lot, that if this doesn't suit us, it might suit someone else. So what we do is we look for the kind of circumstances, the kind of people that it might suit. So I think that's why it looks a little bit positive. It's because we're trying to be helpful, and these are good products, and whatever it is in whatever range you're looking at, and there is something for everyone. It just might not be for us. So, think about the positive in the context of a particular user who may not be you, but may get greater value out of it.
Now, as far as next year is concerned, we have a number of plans in place about where we're taking Australian Hiker. Now, this year we did release 45 episodes in the podcast, and that for us is quite a lot, given the amount of time that it takes to get a podcast to air. Typically, by the time I go through and write it up, go through and record, edit, and then post, it's around about a 10-hour process. They do vary. Sometimes they're a bit shorter than that, but usually it's not too much shorter. And as a result, we originally planned to do 3 episodes a month, which would basically give us around about the 36 episodes a year. And as I said, doing that extra 9 episodes is something that we're not necessarily planning on doing next year. So in 2020, it will be somewhere between the 36 to sort of 40-ish episode mark. It really is going to depend. As far as the podcast is concerned, we have done a lot of interviews this year, and partly that's because I've had people approach me about interviewing, but it's also because I suppose I've gained a bit more in confidence that I'm happy to actually contact people I've had no interaction with before and say, this is who we are. And I think our reputation's become good enough where I haven't had anyone knock me back on, on actually doing a podcast. So I do still have 2 more interviews left to go between now and the end of 2019. One which will occur next week, and we'll talk about that at the end of the episode. As well as a second episode, which I'm recording over the next few days. And again, this is an overseas interview. And when we talk about producing podcasts in a minute, there are some logistical nightmares that sometimes go with that, that have caused of me to change the way I do things this year. In relation to the hikes for next year, over the last couple of years, we've left it to probably about 3 months out before telling people what we're doing. We decided this next year we're just going to be upfront about what we're doing next year. So the plan is at Easter next year to finish off the remainder of the Human Hovel Track. We've got about approximately 116 kilometres. So Easter's a good time weather-wise, and also time off to be able to finish that off. And my big hike, and this is something that Jill doesn't necessarily want to do late in the year, is the Australian Alps walking track. I did a section of that at Easter this year as part of a taste test and a bit of an indication of what it would be like to do that track. And while I did only do one section, it helped to provide me with a bit of overview and things to go forward with for the planning phase over the next 12 months.
Yeah, I think on that one I might be the car support on that one, maybe. Or the food drop or something like that. Or I might just stay home and, do something pleasant, Tim.
And strangely enough, one of the reasons we actually did the Human Hovel Track this year is because it did require us to do food caching, to drop food off in the middle of nowhere and collect it on the way through. And that's certainly something that needs to be done on the Australian Alps walking track. So for me, at least, the Human Hovel Track was a bit of a testing point just to see how logistics go. Gear reviews. In 2020, the plan is to do 150 reviews. And for me, that means being a bit more organised and coordinated about how we do things. And we're trying to get a good mix of reviews. So as an example, I've got my books between now and the end of 2020 sitting there by the side of my bed to go through and do reviews on. And the aim is to do about 1 book review a month. But we want to try and get a good mixture of gear. And as Jill mentioned earlier on, one of the weaknesses over the last couple of years has been female-centred clothing. So we're trying to remedy that over the next 12 months.
Yeah, and not just with the female clothing, but all other types of hiking gear and across a number of different brands. We've had a really good response from the suppliers, and they're quite keen to provide gear for us to test out. And I should say that on the reviews that we do, none of the wholesalers or the producers of the gear either ask for or have the opportunity to vet the articles and vet the reviews that we do. That's not part of the conversation that we enter into with them. And to be honest, if that's what we want, we would be a little bit suspicious about that. We try to be helpful in identifying the kind of hiker who would be most interested in the gear that we've reviewed. So while it might not be for us, sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. We don't want anybody editing what we're doing.
Now on to the podcast production side of things. And again, many people may not be overly interested in this, but we've had enough requests that we over the last couple of years and over the last year in particular about how we go through and get the podcast to air. Certainly from my perspective, there's probably 3 components to this. The first is the equipment side of things. And each year over the last couple of years, I've spent a bit of money on upgrading some of the technology. So now I'm using a new podcasting unit, which is called a Rode Podcaster. And it just allows us to do interviews in particular that have been done overseas. And I'll talk about some of the logistical issues that I had over this last year that really drove me to buy this particular unit.
So the first thing that you need to do is get friendly with your local, upmarket music store, equipment store, and they know all of this stuff and what will work and what won't work. There's a really interesting crossover between podcasting and performing, musical performance. So I've actually found that quite interesting, having no sense of musicality whatsoever.
And from my perspective this year, the focus, while the equipment is essential to go through and to be able to produce a podcast, it's probably just one small component. The other thing we've been trying to do with the podcast, or we'll be focusing on the podcast this year, is the production quality. So many of you may or may not have noticed that we reduced the introductory music by a number of seconds earlier this year. The way we started off in 2016, the views on how the introduction should go has changed, so we've shortened it slightly. We've tried to become more regular in our segments that we go through and put on, and this always doesn't necessarily happen. So things like hiking news or iTunes Apple podcast reviews and a number of other segments that we put on. So I think hiking hacks as an example, we try and forecast these on a regular basis. Doesn't always come out as where we thought they would do. We try to, where we can, to keep the podcasts to around the 30-minute mark. But again, it's not the sort of thing. Doesn't always happen. And certainly I always consider that in what we're writing and what we're editing, just so people aren't getting bored with the conversation. The other thing from a perspective of getting the podcast together is finding out what people want to hear. So I schedule podcast on what I think I would like to hear, and usually I get it right. But what does surprise me is I do episodes where I think, yep, this is going to do really well, and they do okay. And then other episodes where I think, well, it's a topic we need to talk about. I don't think it'll get many downloads, and all of a sudden it rockets through the roof and does really well. So it's a bit of a guessing game about what you as our listeners want to hear. One of the things we did over the last couple of weeks for our third birthday celebrations, we gave people an opportunity to win a gift voucher from Wild Earth. And the question we asked was, what interviews do you want to hear on the Australian Hiker podcast? And I must admit, it was quite gratifying when a number of people made suggestions that I've already got booked in, or in fact, I'm just one of the episodes in particular that was requested, I'm actually doing that interview this Friday. So, people have got similar sorts of ideas about what they want to hear and what I think they want to hear. The downside to that, I suppose, was we, having produced now the 130-odd episodes, people don't necessarily listen to all of them. They might come in at episode 100 or 110 and not bother to listen to the earlier episodes. But what we did come across was people asking for episodes that we have already produced. Particularly in relation, as an example, I'll say here, we had a request for interviews with other hikers and a podcast on the Overland Track, and we've got a number of those episodes which are around about episode 20. And if you're not going back and listening to all those, you may not necessarily realise they exist. So we do know that we need to sort of promote our back catalogue a bit more and make people aware of what we do have available. From a getting everything together perspective, usually we try and do our podcast recording on Sundays. It doesn't always work out that way. It really depends on how busy our weekend's being and what's going on. So in the case of this episode, it's recorded the night before it's released because we're recording it the day after our birthday, so we can sort of start quoting figures with accuracy. When I first started recording the episode back in 2016, I was staying up late and releasing the podcast at around about 2 o'clock in the morning. I've now changed that. I'm now actually releasing the episodes where I can on Tuesday night or very early Wednesday morning, but I try and get them out Tuesday night.
You're still staying up late, though.
I'm still staying up late, but nowhere near what I used to be. So it's the sort of thing that one of the big keys in podcast production is consistency. I know I listen to around about 11 hours of podcasts a week, and if there's an episode that hasn't been released and I'm waiting for it, it does annoy me. So I try to make sure within a couple of hours the podcasts are produced and released on a regular basis. So, at least 36 times a year, the Australian Hiker podcast is going to be produced. We're not going to have periods of 2 or 3 or 4 weeks where you don't hear from us. That will never happen. Some of the logistical issues with getting the podcast to air, which drove me insane this year and really had forced me into buying new equipment, was a number of our overseas interviews are done by Skype. And I don't have a cabled internet connection. I use Wi-Fi. And what that means is we're on the edge of the signal area, and particularly when everybody else is using the Wi-Fi signal at nighttime, it means we were often struggling to get Skype signal. I had 2 nights in a row a few months ago where I was recording. I recorded 2 podcast episodes almost over a 2 or 3 day period. And what had ended up happening, the signal was so bad, I ended up driving my car along with all my podcast equipment down to the school oval. And I was sitting there in the dark with my computer and my microphone and my phone and everything else, recording in the only area that I could actually get a signal, which was in the middle of the school oval, basically. So I've now rectified that issue. I realised what the technical problems were, and the new recording system that I'm using now deals with that issue really well, and it means I don't have to leave the house to go through and record a Skype interview anymore.
Yeah, and I think that's one of those things around some of this production side that, things don't always go to plan. And not only do you have to have a plan B, sometimes you have to have a plan C.
Yeah, it really is one of those things that you think things will work a certain way and it don't. I had another episode which I also recorded earlier this year with Joel and Carvin, who's better known as Boots McFarlane, and I ended up going to a family wedding in regional New South Wales and got to where we were staying expecting to have internet signal, which we did. I could get emails, but I couldn't actually do Skype. So I had to actually reschedule that interview for a few days later. And it's just one of these sort of things that it's a real learning curve. Certainly from the point of view of the Human Hovel track walk, this was very different in relation to the Bibbulmun track walk that I did the year before. The year before, I was getting into a town or going through a town at least every 5, if not every 8 days. So I was able to sit myself in a hotel room, record, go through and put the podcast together, edit it, and release it. With the Human Hovel walk, I was recording, editing, and publishing the podcast for that hike actually in my tent on the trail. And that was again a learning curve, and it was a good learning experience that I will take with me on the Australian Alps walking track next year, because I'm going to have exactly the same issues, and I now know what I need to do to be able to produce over a period of weeks.
I've just remembered one of the lows of the podcast was probably me falling asleep in the tent on the Human Hovel track while we were doing the podcast.
I did manage to cut most of the yawn out, but if you listen closely, you can just hear a bit of Jules yawning as she's trying to respond to the question. And then in the morning I said,
did we finish the podcast?
So I think it's one of those sort of things. Many of you actually may know someone that podcasts, or you may podcast yourself. Doing it in a home environment where you've got a nice warm room and you've got good internet signal, as opposed to doing it in the middle of nowhere. One other thing I would actually comment on the recording of our podcast, and this is something that's very unique to the style of podcasting we do, is interviewing other hikers on the trail. I'm a large male. I probably come across as a threatening presence when people first come across me, particularly if it's a solo female hiker. So I'm very conscious about impacting on people's hikes, and I don't tend to put myself in people's faces and say, "Hey, this is who we are. Do you want an interview?" There is a process I go through, and sometimes it's a very short process when people know who I am. Other times that it might take a little while for people to warm up to me. And in some respects, having Jill there with me when hiking as a couple is a bit easier. It makes me appear harmless. So.
Well, it makes at least less threatening, or someone else is going to take control. I don't know.
So yeah, it's there are all sorts of logistical issues with recording and editing and getting podcasts to air in the middle of nowhere. It really is quite an interesting process. And I must admit, I don't think, some of the podcasts I listen to are on how to do podcasting, and this is a topic that's never really covered. Okay, so I hope this has provided a bit of an insight into what we go through. As I said, for us, it's about a 10-hour process, so I'm not going to go through that whole sort of stage, but at least it gives you an indication of some of the highs and lows we go through in trying to get the podcast to air. But it's something that I've really enjoyed, and for me, the focus on the next 12 months is improving the sound quality where I can, and to make it sound like a more enjoyable sort of experience. So hopefully I'll get that goal achieved over the next year. In next week's podcast episode, we're going to be talking to the Outward Bound organisation. And for many people that have been involved in the outdoors and hiking for quite a while, Outward Bound is a name that you may have come across but may not know too much about. This is an organisation that does outdoor experiences and outdoor training, and it was certainly we came across the Outward Bound crew at a presentation we were doing, and thought, yes, this is something that would be worthwhile having a chat about. So that's next week's podcast episode. As always, this episode can be listened to with all the others through the Australian Hiker website at www.australianhiker.com.au, through Apple Podcasts, through Stitcher Radio, through Spotify, and any number of other podcatching services that you may go through and listen to. And one of the things that I must admit, it's probably not a huge series of downloads for us, but we're also can be listened to on Radio Australia, which says we must be forming part of the Australian culture if that's the case. That's all for me. Bye for now.
And bye from me.